University of California Cooperative Extension and University of California Davis Veterinary Medicine is bringing to you a recording from their March 2024 webinar series. This series was co-hosted by University of California Cooperative Extension advisors Tracy Schohr, Grace Woodmansee, Rebecca Ozeran, and specialist Dr. Gaby Maier. Additional resources from this webinar and other cattle health videos can be found at ucanr.edu/sites/rangelands/cattle health. This session is focused on cattle AI tips for herd improvement with featured speaker Dr. Brett McNabb with the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine.
As we go through, we're going to talk about why we want an AI in the first place. Some considerations for semen selection, handling, some thoughts on estrus detection, estrus and ovulation synchronization, and then we'll go into some technique and some overall greater concepts about maximizing success. So, why is this important? So we know that sire selection, so choosing the right bull or the right semen, can really give you the best opportunity for genetic change, genetic diversity, and overall improvement of particular traits. And of course, those are all going to vary from ranch to ranch or operation to operation based on trajectory and areas that you want to improve in. We know that all the home-raised females we often keep will limit the potential for change over a rapid period of time. And so bringing in outside genetics can have some rapid and long-term impact on the herd. And by doing artificial insemination, we can really rapidly change that genetic makeup of a herd, and we can spread genetics, across the world relatively easily. We'll also consider the economic impact of this. So the cost of maintaining bulls, especially when we have a well-defined breeding season, and if we have one of those per year, then we're not using bulls for the majority of the year, but they still have costs for feed and health maintenance associated with them. And so using AI, even though we have more input in terms of semen, buying hormones and labor requirements for synchronization, in the end, sometimes it can be much more economical to do that exclusively as opposed to maintaining bulls. So who's using artificial insemination? So in the 2017 NOMS report, which was a large survey that looked at surveyed beef operations across the country, looking at various parameters for management and health status. It's interesting to see that if we look at who's using artificial insemination across heifers and cows, relatively few number of heifers and cows bred in the United States are being bred through artificial insemination. More have a combination of artificial insemination and then follow-up or cleanup bulls that are introduced afterwards to take care of any open animals that were left over after the breeding. And if we look at the size of the herd and how they incorporate different reproductive technologies here on the right, you can see that it might not be too much of a surprise that larger operations, so 200 head or more, are going to be incorporating artificial insemination more often than smaller operations. Again, that's not exclusively using AI, but it's likely using AI in combination with cleanup bulls as we go. So again, this isn't for everybody, but it does have a place. And if you're looking for a more rapid genetic change in your herd, then this can be something that you can start with. So again, generally, look at cattle and specifically Bos Taurus cattle, so Angus, Hereford, Charolais, the like. We're likely going to see puberty around 9 to 10 months of age. That's important because when we start to talk about breeding, and especially estrus and ovulation synchronization, we need to have a post-pubertal animal that's regularly cycling. And so in order to do that, we need to make sure they are of the right age and that they've met minimum weights, because we know they're not going to go through puberty until they're roughly 50% of their expected mature body weight. So we're going to wait till they're much farther than that before we start to try and breed them. If you're working with Brahman-influenced cattle, so Brahma, like Zebu-influenced breeds, even Brangus, we sometimes will see a delay in the onset of puberty, sometimes up to 15 or 16 months of age. So you might be delaying your breeding of heifers by sometimes up to a year as compared to our Bos Taurus broods. Most heifers will start to cycle and come into cyclicity naturally, but we can help them along sometimes, and we'll talk about some hormonal approaches there. And we talk about breeding sinus exams in the bulls many times, but sometimes the female side gets forgotten about. And so certainly before heifers are bred for the first time, we can do a female reproductive tract score or a breeding sinus exam where we look at evidence of cyclicity. So are her ovaries, do they appear to be cycling and functional? Evidence of recent ovulations. Do we want to consider doing a pelvic measurement to make sure she doesn't have an abnormally shaped pelvis that might cause problems or dystocia when it comes to calving? And then even body condition scoring, because we know that nutrition plays such a huge role in reproduction that we want to make sure that they're not either emaciated or obese at the time of breeding. And again, the bovine estrus cycle, we're going to be manipulating it, so we want to talk about some of the basics. Averages about 21 days. So every 21 days, cows should be regularly cycling. There is a range, right? That's going to depend on age and the breed, but it's going to be an average of 21 days. It's a cyclical pattern, so it continues to cycle over and over until there's a reason not to cycle, such as pregnancy, severe disease, and nutritional swings. It is driven by hormones, and there's a pretty intricate communication between the uterus, the ovaries, and the brain in terms of hormonal regulation of ovulation and of follicular development, which we're going to talk about here. It's also going to play into the maintenance of pregnancy and the display of estrus or heat. So as we start, some general considerations. We're talking about breeding or AI in cows. We generally want them to be at least 60 days post-calving. So at least 60 days since their previous calf was born. Heifers, we want them to be past puberty, cycling, and an appropriate size. And again, nutrition, especially in heifer raising, plays a big component where we have puberty about 50% of their mature body weight. We often are going to wait until they're about 65% of their expected body weight, which in a lot of our Bos Taurus cattle will be 850 to 900 pounds. Wait till they're at least that size before we consider breeding them. Of course, we also target that 2-year birth date as their first targeted calving event. So if we wait until about 14 to 15 months of age before breeding, that sets us up for them to calve for the first time at 2 years of age. Appropriate nutrition and mineral supplementation. Reproduction is not essential for life, right? So if we have severe disease or nutritional imbalances or trace mineral deficiencies, the reproductive system is often the first thing to shut down. And so that's where we start to see reductions in conception rates or reduced pregnancy rates at the end of a breeding season. And the major players in trace minerals in California, of course, are going to be copper, selenium, and zinc, both from a female and a male fertility perspective, as well as maintaining that pregnancy to term. So we want to make sure that in addition to general energy and protein levels, we're maintaining our trace mineral balance in the herd. A vaccination plan. Again, we're not going to talk specifically about vaccines tonight, and everyone has a slightly different approach to vaccination. So I'm going to be the last one to recommend you change something without knowing much about your herd or the endemic diseases that you're facing. But whatever we're doing, we want to make sure that cows and heifers are appropriately vaccinated before we start to breed, whether that's natural breeding or artificial insemination. And above everything else, we do not want to be vaccinating females within 30 days of artificial insemination. We know, especially with modified live vaccines, the vaccines that you need to reconstitute and then you have a short window to give, it causes this transient inflammation in the female reproductive tract, and then specifically the oviduct. And because of that, if we were to say vaccinate at the beginning of a synchronization protocol, which would be within 8 to 10 days of artificial insemination, we know that there would be so much inflammation at the time of AI that we would have virtually a 0% conception rate. And so if we are going to be boosting vaccines before breeding, we're going to wait at least 30 days before breeding to do that. And then we're going to try and minimize stress. So ideally, not hauling them, transporting them, stressing them, especially in the first month to 40 days after breeding, when that conceptus is still a very small young embryo. We know that most of our pregnancy losses that we see in cattle tend to happen before day 42 of pregnancy. So that first period of time is relatively sensitive to external stresses, heat stress, whether that's ambient temperature or fever, and the like. And then really, we encourage everyone to establish a relationship with a veterinarian, one for general herd health and protocols, but also for advice on specific synchronization protocols, and of course, the ability to obtain prescriptions for antimicrobials, anti-inflammatories, and some of the reproductive hormones that we're going to be discussing tonight. I mentioned nutrition and what an important role that is. One way you can assess your nutritional status, of course, is through body condition scoring. And without going into too much detail about it, we're going to hopefully see cows calving between a body condition score 5 or 6, heifers slightly heavier, knowing that they're going to be losing body condition as they nurse that calf and start to regain cyclicity. There was an interesting study done a few years ago, which is this chart that you're seeing on the left, looking at the body condition score that the cows were at the time of calving, and then what percentage were actually cycling normally at 60 or 90 days post-calving. And as you can see, as you increase in your body condition score, we have a very direct linear increase in the percentage of cows that are cycling by those different benchmarks. If we're going to be trying to AI and breed these cows somewhere between 60 and 90 days after calving, you can see how important that's going to be for regaining cyclicity. And then if you're looking to incorporate artificial insemination into your herd, either for the first time or as an ongoing practice, some big picture things to think about would be starting the breeding season with artificial insemination and then following up with cleanup bulls. So turning bulls in to catch and breed any heifer or cow that did not conceive to the artificial insemination. You're not going to get 100% conception. If we think about a one-time breeding event that a bull would have with a heifer or a cow, we often will only see about a 70% conception rate. Now, many times that bull will breed that heifer or cow many times while they're in heat, so that increases our percentages and increases our overall conception rate. But if we're trying to be critical of ourselves, we need to think about one-time artificial insemination would be equivalent to a one-time breeding from a bull. And so we often see, on average, a 70% conception rate in beef cattle when everything is going as good as it can. And as we'll talk about, we have some pitfalls and some places that things can very easily take a turn and not go as well. If we're doing heifers or cows, again, heifers often need a head start, so we often try to breed them a bit earlier than our mature cows. One, to allow us to be there at the time of calving, because we know that they might have a higher incidence of dystocia, just because they're still somewhat small framed as compared to the older mature cows. And by calving earlier, it gives them an extra month between that first calf and that breeding that comes subsequent to that, for them to continue to grow and catch up and regain some body condition. So it can actually help your 2-year-olds in their conception rates for a subsequent pregnancy. When we are using AI and then cleanup bulls, we're reducing the number of bulls that we truly need, right? We often talk about anywhere from 1 bull for every 25 to 30 cows, and that changes based on terrain and breed and a couple of different factors. If we're using a cleanup bull after AI, we may only need 1 bull for every 50 cows in the herd, because we know that a chunk of them should already be pregnant and won't be cycling. So we can really stretch out our bull resources, and we might not have to maintain as many bulls in the bull battery every year as we might need without artificial insemination. And then over time, if you're using artificial insemination and breeding with AI at the beginning of the breeding season, before you turn bulls in, over time, you'll tend to see an increasing conception rate because the cows or the heifers that conceive at the very beginning of the season, we know are going to calve in the beginning of your calving season. They're going to go on to wean a heavier weight calf because there's more time for that calf to grow. And they've set themselves up to be cycling and ready to breed early in the following breeding season. So over time, these early conceivers begin to add up, and breeding and conception becomes easier as years go on because you're whether intentionally or inadvertently selecting for cows that will conceive early in the breeding season. So you may see this trend. So when it comes to AI in cattle, frozen semen is standard. So some other species we can use frozen or fresh or extended chilled semen. But the standard in the industry, both domestically and internationally, is for frozen semen. It's going to be dosed that one straw that you purchase is one insemination dose. And if you think about how we can spread sperm and genetic material wide, you can get roughly 250 to 300 straws or doses off of one ejaculate from a bull when it's been collected and extended properly. So we really do have the potential to use a small number of males and spread their genetic material quite far and wide. So conventional semen is going to be anywhere from 10 to 30 million sperm per dose. That's going to typically come in a half cc straw. If you're using sexed semen, which has been selected for X or Y sperm, typically X sperm, because we're typically selecting for a higher percentage of heifers to be born as compared to bull calves, that's going to have a much lower concentration. So anywhere from 2 to 10 million sperm per dose. And most of the commercially available semen is in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 million sperm per dose for sex semen right now. It's going to come in a quarter mil straw, so a smaller, slightly narrower straw that you buy. We'll talk about some differences if you're using sexed semen as compared to conventional semen, but many people will use sex semen in heifers, knowing that on average, a heifer calf will be lighter weight than a bull calf, so you might lower your incidence of dystocia. And it's a way to sort of jumpstart some of your herd-based replacement females. But because of the sorting process that's used, and it's pretty cool, with these large machines called flow cytometers, they line up the sperm and assign them a charge, and then they divert X and sperm different directions into basically different pools that they use to then market. But because of that stress, the sperm typically have a shorter lifespan in the reproductive tract as compared to conventional non-sorted sperm. So a lot of our timing for insemination in these protocols will reflect that shorter lifespan. And as a general rule, if we're using sex semen, we're going to see a slightly lower conception rate as compared to conventional semen that would be following the same protocol. Many straws that are commercially prepared and available will be following the Certified Semen Services protocols. And the CSS logo you see here would be printed on the straw. That's showing that they are following established processing protocols, and that the bulls in the bull studs that are being collected and used have very specific disease testing requirements that are performed on a regular basis to ensure that we're not inadvertently spreading disease, bacteria, viruses, that sort of thing in the semen, because a lot of that is transmissible venereally. So if you are buying semen, you can look for that. Not all semen has that, and that's okay. But if you see this, it means that that bull has met very stringent standards. If you're going to be storing semen or embryos, you're going to be using a liquid nitrogen tank. So these are basically a tank within a tank, as you can see from the cutaway section here. It's a small tank where the liquid nitrogen and all of our semen or embryos will be stored in canisters. And then it's a very well-insulated, vacuumed buffer between that inner tank and the outer shell and the outside world. And the intent is to have a very well-insulated tank, because we're going to be keeping liquid nitrogen, which is about minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit, so quite cold, in there We'll also have a vapor state above the liquid before it gets up into the neck of the tank. And we really want to make sure that we are maintaining a consistent temperature and a very low temperature to pretty much indefinitely preserve sperm and embryos. When we are handling semen or embryos for that matter, we have some basic concepts to keep in mind. You can see that as we get into the neck of the tank, which is where we pull out the cork, we can look down before the whole body of the tank widens out. The temperature increases very quickly as it goes from that minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit up to ambient temperature. So if you are pulling straws of semen out, you really have only about 6 to 8 seconds to be above what we call the frost line. So if you look down the neck, you'll see this frost line on the inside of that neck. That's where we have this dramatic temperature change. And once it's above the frost line, we know that that semen is starting to thaw. The thawing isn't so much the problem, it's the resubmerging the rest of the semen back into the liquid nitrogen in a very uncontrolled manner that can cause ice crystal formation and sperm death. So if we're doing that, we have a very short period of time to pull up our cane, pull our straw of semen out, and put the rest back in before we have irreversible damage. If you're buying and selling semen, it's the same thing. You need to have both tanks next to each other. You identify the straw you're going to remove, pull it out, and put it right into the next tank immediately. We put a lot of faith in that sperm was collected from the bull appropriately, extended, frozen, stored, transferred, stored again in an appropriate way. And there's a lot, if a tank goes dry and then is refilled, you may not know it until you go to thaw straws and you find a bunch of dead sperm. So it's going to be important to handle there. Also, if you have your own tank at home, make sure that it's being kept in a well-ventilated place and that the tank is sitting on a piece of wood or rubber and not directly on concrete or stone, because we do worry about condensation on the bottom causing damage to the tank. So choosing that semen. We can use a couple different factors. Two I'm going to talk about today are the expected progeny difference and genetic testing. So the EPD, or the expected progeny difference, is a prediction based on current information of the genetic potential of a bull for a particular trait. So we're typically going to be using economically important traits like birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, calving ease, scrotal circumference measurements, carcass quality, ribeye area, that sort of thing. And their estimated breeding values based on his performance of his offspring, and performance of other contemporary groups that are measured. These are calculated by the breed associations, and they're meant to be used to compare one animal in a particular breed to another animal in the same breed. We're really trying to compare these bulls, one against each other and then against the national average for that particular breed of a particular trait. So you can see on the left here is an example of just a snippet from a line of EPDs that you might see. And again, by themselves, these numbers don't mean much. You have to compare them to something else before they're useful. And I'll show you an example in a second. But here we would have the calving ease direct, calving ease direct, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, scrotal circumference, calving ease maternal milk production for beef cattle. And we're going to have the value given to them. We're going to have an accuracy, again, based on how reliable the information is, which is going to be related to how much data is available. And then where in the breed they rank in terms of percentile. And so as you can see, the accuracy really indicates the spread of expected outcomes. We can have the same average EPD, but with two different accuracies or reliabilities, we might have a distribution that's much wider. The average is the same, but we see more variation. So looking at not only the value, but the accuracy is going to be important. So we might look online or in a catalog at different bulls. So this is Ashland. He's going for $35 and he is well represented in the American Angus Association. So as you can see, we can look at EPDs, accuracies, and how he ranks in terms of the Black Angus breed for all of our different production maternal carcass traits. We also have different indices, which we'll talk about, which is the breed association's attempt to take the data based on his expected performance and assign some or factor in some assumptions financially and give you a one value description of him that you can use to compare him to other bulls in terms of, will he be profitable to maintain home raised females from? Will his offspring be productive and efficient in the feedlot? Those sorts of things. Each breed sets their own index. So again, on their own, these numbers don't necessarily mean much. And I should tell you that all of these different values, all these different numbers are measured in the units that we would typically measure in. So anything with weight would be in pounds. If we're looking at residual average daily gain, there are a lot of different calculations. Scrotal circumference would be in centimeters. Carcass traits, marbling area, ribeye area, back fat thickness, that's right. So we could compare two bulls to each other. And this is where EPDs are useful because we can compare not only their pedigrees and key information, we can look and see how their expected outcomes for their offspring relate. So if we look at Confidence Plus on the left and Whitlock on the right, again, two examples of Black Angus bulls, we can see their birth dates, birth weights, weaning weights, yearling weights, scrotal circumference scores, etc. there. And then we can compare their EPDs, which are going to be on this line right here. So again, we can directly compare EPDs. Let's pick on birth weight for a second, BW over here. We can see that Confidence Plus has a birth weight of minus 1.7, and Whitlock has a birth weight of 0.6. That's going to be measured in pounds. By themselves, they don't mean much other than we can compare them and say Confidence Plus will, on average, produce a lower weight calf than Whitlock because his EPD is lower than Whitlock. However, if you want to know how they compare back to the breed average, you can look at the documented breed averages that are on the bottom of all these catalogs and readily available at all through all the breeding associations. So we know that the American Angus breed average for birth weight is 1.2. And this is what's really confusing about using EPDs in beef cattle. 0 doesn't always mean average, and a positive or a negative value does not always mean above or below the breed average. Over time, we've had a lot of genetic drift, and it's made it complicated to sometimes interpret these. So here we can say, if we compare to the breed average, we can say that both of these bulls are below breed average for birth weight. And compared between the two bulls, Confidence Plus will, on average, produce a lighter weight calf than Whitlock. I hope that makes sense. Lower birth weight is good if you're looking for a lower incidence of dystocia, right? Other values you might want to have above breed average for different production traits. So they can be used, and they're quite handy when you compare them. We can also do the selection by index. So as I mentioned, different breed associations will calculate these indices for you, trying to combine many different traits and economic assumptions into one particular value. So for example, the $B is a great way to look at the potential for future progeny for their different profitability. $M might look at the maternal value of a weaned calf. So we can use these as another tool to help us choose bulls or semen that we want to bring into the herd. So that's all been based on known data from the bull or his offspring, right? And combining all of it over the years, getting more and more accurate. Now, of course, we have a lot of DNA-based technology that either complements EPDs or in some cases has replaced EPDs altogether. And since the cattle genome was sequenced back in 2009, this market has exploded, hasn't it? That we have markers for everything. We have genetic tests for everything. It's a very useful tool to use when you're trying to choose both replacement females and select sires. The genetic markers that we use, one of them that's very common are these single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are called SNPs for short. They are these precise nucleotide base pairs that are known to be responsible for certain phenotypic traits. So economic traits that we can see. We have gone back and we know what combinations of these different nucleotides in the DNA at different locations on the chromosomes contribute to that phenotype that we like and see. So we'll use these different marker alleles that we know of for these complex traits, and we've developed these SNP chips, that they're often called, that can analyze tens of thousands of these different alleles and assign a molecular breeding value. So now we're not just saying, well, gosh, what does this bull produce? What can we see that his offspring had produced? We're saying now we know what his exact genetic potential is, and we can select based on that. So this leads us to marker-assisted selection. And there are a lot of these genomically enhanced EPDs that are available commercially to use. And so between Zoetis and Neogen, we have, as you can see, these SNP chips that cover anywhere from 14 to 16 economically important traits that are covering well over 50,000 different markers, combining them all into what we know about their link to phenotypic expression. And Neogen is only about it's either $39 or $40 a test now. So while that adds up over a lot of numbers, it's a relatively small investment to really get a lot of data coming back. It's really amazing how much data is available to you if you're interested in looking at it. And as just as an example, for one of the identity markers, some of the different traits that are used, 17 maternal traits, performance traits, and carcass traits, along with parentage. So if you submit samples from offspring and you submit samples of DNA from all the possible sires, you can actually establish the parentage as well, because they'll rule in or rule out different bulls based on genetic makeups. And this can be helpful for pedigrees and for breed registration if you're trying to establish who the father is when you had multiple bulls breeding the breed. We also, the vet genetics lab here on the UC Davis campus is amazing. And they cover genetic testing for a whole host of species. And they handle a lot of the parentage verification and DNA verification for breed associations in the United States. One thing they also do, in addition to just parentage and important trait selection, is genetic disease testing. And one of the great things about genetic testing is that we can screen animals to see if they're carriers of known genetic disease, or if we have a deformed calf born, we can take samples of it and see if it is if the deformation is a result of a known genetic disease. And so if you go onto the VGL website, it's pretty impressive across all the different species what genetic tests we have. And we know in cattle there are dozens we can check for, and many breed associations will require that excuse me, registered males and females be free and not a carrier for genetic disease that's known to exist. So Black Angus, Herefords, Shorthorns, Charolais have been very good about recognizing genetic disease that exists in that breed and trying to get rid of it through testing and not letting carrier animals be registered in the association. Okay. Let's transition to the female side of this now. Estrous cycle and synchronization. So a word of warning. This can be a bit of an abstract concept if you haven't seen it before. So I'm not going to try and be overwhelming. I'm going to try and go through it fairly methodically, but we can certainly clarify any questions we have at the end. But manipulating the estrous cycle of cows is very useful and, as you'll see, may be necessary if you're doing timed insemination protocols, but it can be a bit confusing to start. So let's start with the basics. The bovine estrus cycle. Again, on average, 21 days in length. And so that means from ovulation to ovulation in a normally cycling female. We can divide this up into two different phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And so this is really being defined by what structures are on the ovaries at any given time. In the follicular phase, we have these large dominant follicles that are growing up, getting ready to ovulate that egg just before ovulation, typically characterized by a very high level of estrogen because we have estrogen being released from these developing follicles. Estrogen leads to estrus, or that behavioral display of heat. Once we have ovulation, kind of an explosive event, the egg goes off into the oviduct, we have that follicle collapse back in and remodel into what we call this corpus luteum. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. That's going to go on to produce progesterone, which would be the hormone that maintains pregnancy if the animal is pregnant. If the animal is not pregnant, then that CL goes away, it regresses, that progesterone level drops off, and we allow another follicle that's to come up and become dominant and ovulate, and the whole process starts all over again. We can also divide this up into different stages of the cycle. So estrus, or standing heat, sexual receptivity in the cow, is a relatively short event. They're often only in estrus for about 12 hours at a time. Unique to cows, they're going to ovulate after they go out of heat and then get into what we call the mid-estrus period. That's going to be followed by diestrus. And again, diestrus is where we have a nice mature corpus luteum producing progesterone going along. And then once that corpus luteum goes away in a normally cycling animal, we'll get into what we call this proestrus period. So the period just before estrus, where we see estrogen rising again. Now, the bovine ovary is pretty cool. And it's a very dynamic structure that's always active. I want you to think about, you have two different ovaries in the animal, and they have these follicles always emerging. So we call them follicular waves, and these are diagrammed right here. But we're going to have these very, very small follicles containing the eggs that are going to start to grow and increase. They're going to be growing and increasing, producing more estrogen. But when they get to a certain point, they're going to suppress all the other follicles from developing. And they're going to go on to basically become the sole dominant follicle, right? Cows, as a rule, will ovulate one egg each cycle. Every now and then, they ovulate two, and very rarely they ovulate 3 or 4. If that developing follicle containing the egg cannot ovulate, it'll regress and go away and never get a chance to ovulate. As that goes away, another emerging follicular wave can start, as you can see here. If we get the chance to ovulate, then that follicle will become dominant and then respond to what we call an LH surge, or a surge of luteinizing hormone coming from the brain in response to all the estrogen being produced by that follicle and cause ovulation. So, what allows a follicle to ovulate or not ovulate? As you can see here, let's start at the beginning. We're going to have ovulation, day 0. Okay, we're going to get into this mid-estrus period where we have the corpus luteum forming after ovulation. That's going to go on to produce progesterone. And in this graph, progesterone is this green line right here. So we're seeing our increasing and then our plateau of progesterone levels. Now, in the background, we have an emerging follicular wave. In cattle, they cannot ovulate if progesterone is dominant. So if we have a lot of progesterone, either from an existing corpus luteum or from progesterone that we're providing through a synchronization protocol, that follicle will never achieve dominance or ovulate. So it's going to regress and go back down. The next follicular wave starts to emerge. Now, coincidentally, nature is good like this. As that second follicular wave in most of our standard cattle breeds is emerging, and the animal's not pregnant, we're going to see a demise of that corpus luteum. It's going to go away. As that progesterone level drops off, we now have a progesterone-free environment. That follicle can go on to grow, achieve dominance, and ovulate in response to that LH or that luteinizing hormone surge that comes from the brain. We're going to use the basis of this to synchronize and manipulate the cycle of cows and heifers so that we can have an appropriate timing for our artificial insemination. All these different stages of the cycle correlate to different structures on the ovaries. And if we're palpating cows transrectally or using ultrasound, we can identify the different ovarian structures that correspond. So if we're palpating cows, we can tell what stage of the cycle she's in. When it comes to AI in cattle, especially in beef cattle, the vast majority, in fact, almost exclusively, we never do that. So we're going to be starting to synchronize blindly. And that's where we have some different protocols that we're putting into place. So again, if you look at the ovaries, on the top picture, you can see this blister-like structure here is a nice dominant follicle. That's going to contain the egg. It's producing a lot of estrogen, leading to estrus or standing heat. Once that ovulates, it's going to turn into a corpus luteum. So this sort of yellow-bodied, firmer structure right here has a nice little crown on it that we can actually feel transrectally if we're palpating. And it's going to be producing progesterone that's going to maintain a pregnancy if she's pregnant, and it's going to prevent ovulations while progesterone is dominant. I'm not going to go through this, but I wanted just to highlight again the intricate relationship between the brain, so the hypothalamus and the pituitary of the brain, and the ovary, whether it's a developing follicle or the corpus luteum, and all the different positive and negative feedback of hormones that allow normal cyclicity to happen and allow ovulation to occur. We're going to be manipulating and influencing all these hormones with our synchronization protocols, but we don't need to go through the details of this. Unless you'd like to at the end, I'd be happy to walk through it. But there's an ever-changing hormonal state in the female. As we start to think about synchronizing our postpartum cows, we also need to think about what she's doing from her own physiology. Beef cattle have a very strong postpartum anestrus, meaning they don't cycle immediately after calving. And usually it's not until at least 45 to 50 days after calving that they start to resume a normal cycle. And this relates back to the frequency of the calf suckling and nursing. It has a very pronounced block on that luteinizing hormone being able to have a big spike or surge and cause ovulation. So trying to synchronize them really before day 50 is going to be futile. So we're going to be waiting usually until at least 50 to 60 days postpartum before we try to synchronize them. And it really goes back to dealing with this postpartum, very strong lactational anestrus. So if you're going to make a synchronization program work, we have a couple of needs, right? So we need to make sure we have proper facilities, one that are safe for you and the heifer or the cow, because you are going to be, elbow deep in these cows. You don't want too much lateral movement one way or the other for your own safety. And because we're going to have a metal AI gun going through her cervix into her uterus, we don't want the potential to damage her reproductive tract. So whether it's a squeeze chute, whether it's a other kind of lockup, whether it's one of these heifer breeding boxes, something that's going to allow safe restraint. You need females that are cycling. You need to have an IED system. So if you're only AIing one, probably not a big deal. If you're AIing 100 and you're synchronizing 100, you need to be able to positively identify that female every time you give an injection or when you go to breed. You need to have compliance for the injections. So the protocols you'll see, they have many different injections, anywhere from 1 to 5. And so if you need to be giving the correct drug via the correct route, at the correct dose, on the correct day, at the correct time, to the correct animal. And if you're not going to be able to do that, quite honestly, a hormonal synchronization is going to be a waste of money and time, because all the different injections are based on the previous one being given and working appropriately. You need to have appropriate semen, so you've chosen the right bull to use, and it's from a healthy, fertile male, and it's been handled properly the entire time. This is going to require scheduling. So, like I often tell people, AI is never an emergency, so it can be scheduled at your convenience. Day, night, morning, weekends, weekdays, whatever it's going to be best for you. Unless, of course, we're doing estrus detection, which we'll talk about. And then again, safety considerations, like I said, for both you and the cows. So should I synchronize estrus or should I synchronize ovulation? Here's the difference. Like I said, cows and heifers are in heat or in this, standing estrus for only about 12 hours at a time. It's a very short window. Cows are one of the few species we deal with that are going to ovulate after estrus. So after they go out of heat, they tend to ovulate about 12 hours later. Every other species we deal with ovulates sometime during estrus. But cows are unique in that. So if we're synchronizing estrus, we're going to synchronize that. We're going to look for heat, and then we're going to breed her 12 hours later. AM/PM rule. If we're synchronizing ovulation, it's going to be a timed insemination. We're going to bypass the need to detect heat at all. And we're going to be, even though we might see heat along with our synchronization, we're going to be inseminating in a predetermined window of time. So synchronizing estrus will watch for heat and breed accordingly. Tend to have higher labor requirements because you're watching the cows twice a day to see if they're displaying signs of heat. Typically have lower input costs because we're not using the same amount of hormone for synchronization. And as a general rule, we tend to see higher conception rates on average when we breed on a synchronized estrus as compared to ovulation. If we're synchronizing ovulation, we're going to really eliminate the need for heat detection, inseminate at a predetermined time. It does require more handling because we have multiple injections or treatments to give. We have higher pharmaceutical and drug costs. And in general, we have a slightly lower conception rate as compared to breeding on a natural heat. We also see different timelines for inseminating heifers and cows because heifers tend to ovulate a smaller follicle. So they're going to actually ovulate a little bit sooner than a mature cow when everything else is considered normal. So as you'll see, the protocols are slightly different. So if we're detecting heat, this is important, especially if we're going to use our AM/PM rule. If we're detecting heat, when cows are coming into heat or going out of heat, they're often the ones that might be mounting other cows, resting their chin on the tail heads to test for if that animal on the ground is going to stay still and start to walk a lot more around the pen or around the pasture. The cow that's in true standing heat is going to be the one that stands to be mounted. So on the top picture, the cow on the ground is in true standing heat, and the cow mounting her is going to likely be coming into heat or going out of heat. We'll also sometimes we'll see the cows be more aggressive. So they just had put this up in a natural breeding situation. If the bull isn't very interested, the cow might be doing the same actions to try and get him to be interested in her. So resting her chin on his tail head, even mounting him to draw attention there. If we're going to be following this AM/PM rule, which is where we detect heat and then breed half a day later, it comes from the idea that if we catch them in the middle of heat, whenever we know where in that 12-hour window they are, but we know in a half of a day, so roughly 12 hours, she should be out of heat. But if we play our cards right, we should be inseminating before she ovulates. So the AM/PM rule is based on seeing a cow in heat, breeding her 12 hours later to try and inseminate just before ovulation. Now we know with sex semen, because the time frame is a bit shorter because of how much handling and manipulation that the semen has had, we're going to want to try and inseminate a little bit closer to ovulation. So instead of 12 hours later, we often will push that recommendation out to anywhere from 16 to 22 hours after we see the cow in heat. Because again, we want the semen to be in the cow for a shorter period of time as compared to conventional semen. If we're doing this, we're going to watch the cows twice a day, ideally for at least 20 to 25 minutes twice a day, so that we can watch for increased walking and locomotion. We can see who is mounting who. And if we're using estrus detection aids like patches or Kmart patches or tailhead chalk that we put on the top of the tailhead, we can look to see who's been rubbed off. And remember that when we're detecting heat, we're not as good as the bull. So we do rely on a lot of estrus detection aids to give us evidence as to who's still to be mounted by one of her herd mates during the synchronization process. So the synchronization tools that we have available. The first one would be prostaglandin. It's called prostaglandin PGF2 alpha. So you might hear it abbreviated as PG or PGF or PGF2 alpha. When we use it, it's to induce luteolysis. So luteolysis is the whole event of that CL, remember, that formed after ovulation that's producing progesterone. It's the causing it to regress and break down and go away. So whether it happens from a natural surge of prostaglandin in the cow or whether we give it as an injection, it's going to have the same effect. And that CL should be reliable to PGF after day 6 of the cycle. So if you're out and you see a cow get mated by a bull tonight, like, oh, I didn't want that to happen. There's no sense in giving her a dose of prostaglandin before next Tuesday because the CL that forms if she was ovulating won't be responsive for at least 6 days. So our prostaglandin products that we have on the market are Dynaprost and Cloprostinol. So Lutelyse and Estromate would be the two most common ones that we see and use. Lutelyse comes in 2 different concentrations, and Estromate comes in 1. But the Lutelyse dose is going to be 25 milligrams. So either 5 cc's of traditional Lutelyse or 2 cc's of the Lutelyse high concentration. And Estromate, it's going to be a 2 cc dose IM. When we give this, it's to cause that corpus luteum to go away and stop any natural progesterone production that was coming from that CL. And it's very effective. But there is a risk. So there are human safety risks. This can cause the corpus luteum to regress in humans as well. So I really recommend that pregnant women not handle this. And we know that even if you're not pregnant, it can alter cyclicity and cycles. And so it can affect birth control, and it can, again, be harmful to a human pregnancy. Even if you're not pregnant, if you are an asthmatic, this huge prostaglandin surge could actually send you into an asthmatic attack. So years ago, I was on a dairy and I was filling up a very large syringe to give multiple doses of Lutelyse, and the plunger came out of the syringe and it spilled all down my forearm. And I was not pregnant at the time, and I'm not an asthmatic. But I had, for about 45 minutes, I had the worst abdominal cramping I've ever had in my life. And it was just all the smooth muscle, in my body just cramping up like this. And it was absolutely awful. So I was not in an unsafe situation, but if I'd been in a different life state, it could have been bad. So you do want to be careful. It is very easily absorbed across skin, across mucous membranes. And so you do want to be careful when handling prostaglandins. So synchronization tools continued. GnRH, so gonadotropin releasing hormone, is another product that we will use. It's, again, mimicking some of the hormones that are being released from the cow's brain that work at the level of the ovary. So when we give it, we're giving it to have what we call an LH effect in cattle. We are giving it to mimic that LH surge that typically results in an ovulation. The products we have available are here. It's going to typically be a 2 cc dose or 100 micrograms if you're using Cisterellin, Fertigil, or Factrel. There is another product called Gonabreed, which is more concentrated, and it's a 1 cc there. So when we give a dose of GnRH, one of these products, we expect ovulation to occur in about 24 to 30 hours after we give that injection in the majority of cows. Again, it's mimicking that natural LH surge. Even if it doesn't cause a fertile ovulation, what it typically does is cause a developing follicle to stop developing and sort of collapse back in. We don't get an ovulation, but we do get the creation or the formation of a corpus luteum. It's going to produce progesterone, and we can then use to manipulate the cycle from there. And the last tool we have is progesterone. So again, instead of the corpus luteum producing all the natural progesterone in the cow, we can actually give progesterone that's going to mimic that luteal phase. So it's going to mimic the part of the cycle where progesterone is dominant in the cow. It allows this background follicular development to continue. So we still have these follicular waves emerging and regressing on the different ovaries, but it does not allow ovulation to occur. Because remember, cows don't ovulate when progesterone levels are high. It can also be used to suppress heat and estrus. So sometimes in feedlot cattle, they'll be fed progesterone so that they don't cycle while they're on feed. So the two basic forms we have, one would be a CIDR, so controlled intravaginal drug releasing device, that is a silicone-based little T that releases progesterone for up to 14 days. It just sits in the cow's vagina. Or we have an oral source, MGA, or melangestrol acetate. It's available in a premixed and in a pelleted form. You feed a very low dose, so 0.5 milligram per head per day, and that will maintain what we'd call subluteal concentrations, where we are preventing ovulation but still allowing background follicles to develop. It can be used to suppress heat, and it can be used as part of our synchronization. So how are we going to apply these? First, let's talk about some prostaglandin-based protocols, which would be the simplest ways that we can manipulate the cycle. Here, we're just using prostaglandin, so luteolase or estromate, to synchronize estrus. So when we talk about short cycling a cow, we're often talking about giving a dose of prostaglandin to try to shorten her cycle and bring her into heat sooner. If this is going to be effective, she has to have luteal tissue. So she has to have a functional CL on one of her ovaries for this prostaglandin to go and target and cause to regress. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that we don't often know the stage of the cycle that we're starting a synchronization protocol in. So it's often going to be blind. And if we give just one dose of prostaglandin, we see about 2/3 of the cows that are normally cycling respond. Because at any one time, say we have a pen of 100 cows, at any one time, about 2/3 of them should have a functional CL if they're all cycling normally. So one dose would hit 2/3 of them. And they come into heat in 2 to 4 days. So what's quite common to do is to give a 2-dose prostaglandin protocol. Give one dose, wait 11 to 14 days later, and give a second dose. After the second dose, if everyone is cycling, we should have virtually 100% of the herd coming into heat 2 to 4 days later. So after the second dose, we'll start to watch for heat, detect heat, and once we see heat, we'll then breed 12 hours later, or 16 hours later if we're using sexed semen. And we'll do that until we've hit all the animals. There are other options that are out there that suggest to do your 2-dose protocol and wait until 72 hours after the second dose to inseminate everybody. Now that's 3 days. So that's hedging on the bets that 72-hour mark will be in the middle of this whole group coming into heat. But if you have the option to heat detect and breed using prostaglandin, you'll see better results. The variation on cows coming into heat really is dependent on how big the background follicle that's developing is at the time of prostaglandin being given. We can also then get into synchronized or timed artificial insemination using more elaborate synchronization protocols. So in cows, we might talk about having a window of timed AI. So we're going to bypass heat detection altogether and just AI on Sunday morning when I know it's going to be convenient for me. So I have 2 examples here of a 7-day co-sync with a CIDR and a 5-day co-sync with a CIDR. So the concept here is to, again, shorten this estrus cycle that we all know and love and have an exact time frame to inseminate. So the 7-day co-sync would be something like this. We would go ahead and place a CIDR vaginally in the cow. That's going to give us a source of progesterone and prevent any ovulations from happening. We're also going to give a dose of GnRH, so cisterellin, factorel, vertigil. That's going to cause either ovulation of a dominant follicle or a medium-sized follicle to not have a fertile ovulation, but to collapse back in and still create a CL that's going to produce her own progesterone. By doing that, we're starting a new follicular wave to emerge, right? We're sort of resetting the cycle back to here. We're going to go for 7 days, so we can trace that along right here. When we get to 7 days, we're going to give a dose of prostaglandin, so lutelyse or estromate. That's going to get rid of the CL that we just created 7 days ago. We're also going to pull that CIDR out of the cow's vagina. So we're having a immediate cease of all sources of progesterone. That is going to happen as we have this background follicular wave starting to emerge. Once we get rid of that progesterone source, that follicle, we're going to kind of skip over to this part of the cycle, can then emerge, become dominant, and ovulate. We're going to wait 60 to 66 hours in mature cows before we AI and give a second dose of GnRH to help induce ovulation in case it wasn't already happening. Remember that giving a dose of GnRH causes ovulation in about 24 to 30 hours after we give it. And so we're often giving this as a bit of an insurance mechanism to force her to ovulate, for lack of a better word. This window here is important for that final follicular maturation to occur without progesterone on board. Progesterone isn't good for final development of that follicle and the preparation of that egg to ovulate. So we get rid of progesterone wherever we can. That's what led to the development of the 5-day co-sync with the CIDR. We're shortening the CIDR window by 2 days, right? So we start off the same, give a dose of GnRH and place the CIDR in the vagina. But 5 days later, we're going to remove that CIDR and give a dose of prostaglandin. Again, to get rid of that corpus luteum, get rid of the progesterone source. But remember that the CL isn't going to be responsive reliably to 1 dose of prostaglandin until about day 6. So these shorter protocols require 2 doses of lutelyse or estromate, prostaglandin, about 8 to 10 hours apart after you pull that CIDR. But if you notice here, we now have a longer window where there's no progesterone on board. We've gone from 60 to 66 hours to 72 to 74 hours. And that extra bit is enough to allow a really good quality follicle to become dominant and get ready for ovulation. So spreading that out can actually be beneficial. Across both of these synchronization protocols in mature cows, we see anywhere from a 50 to 70% conception rate. And again, there's a lot of factors, semen quality, nutritional effects, etc., that contribute to the variation that we see. So that's the rationale between fixed time insemination in beef cattle. We can also mix it up a bit, and we can use this the concept of our timed insemination, but add a heat detection on top of that. And you might ask, well, what's the point? The whole point of timed AI was to avoid heat detection. Well, like I said, we know that if we can detect heat and breed 12 hours later for conventional semen or 16 hours later for sex semen, that on average, we'll see higher conception rates. So if we do our synchronization, excuse me, pull our CIDR, give prostaglandin, and then start to heat detect an AI as we see animals come into heat. And then anyone who has not come into heat by 80 hours after CIDR pull, or roughly a little over 3 days, then we'll go ahead and AI the remainder and give them GnRH. It can actually increase your conception rates overall, even though there's more labor involved in the heat detection and the AI. There are other versions where we get into split timed AI, again, taking anyone who has come into heat, breeding them, and then waiting another period of time and AIing everybody else, again, to try and one, reduce resources, so reduce the amount of GnRH that you might need to use in your herd, and to give yourself a better chance at a higher conception rate across the herd. In heifers, the same concepts apply, the same hormones and the same drugs apply, but the time frame is going to be different. Recall that heifers tend to ovulate at a slightly smaller follicle than mature cows. And so the time frames reflect that. As you can see on the 7-day co-sync with the cedar in heifers over here, after we pull the cedar and give prostaglandin, we're going to be AIing her only 54 hours or so afterwards. So that's about 8 hours sooner than we would on a cow. If you use a cow synchronization protocol on a heifer, you will likely have a lower than expected conception rate because many times you'll be inseminating the heifers too late. The same concept applies to a shorter 5-day co-sync protocol with a cedar. Again, changing that hourly interval, shortening it as compared to a mature cow. The last variation I'm going to show you is it's a relatively new protocol. And by that I mean in the last 10 years, it's really been coming online. You might have heard about the 7 and 7 sync. Really trying to control the estrous cycle better than a co-sync, give you a greater control over the follicular development happening in the background of the ovaries and the luteal phase here. What it is, and I have the cow and heifer one here. Excuse me, I think I've switched these. This is actually the heifer and this is the cow. I apologize for that. But basically we're placing a cedar in the vagina of the cow, giving her prostaglandin this time at the beginning, and then halfway through the cedar protocol, giving her GnRH to start the emergence of a new follicular wave that will then be becoming dominant after cedar removal. It's gaining a lot of traction in a lot of beef breeding operations, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned it here because actually the physiology behind it makes a lot of sense and gives you a lot of control over that emerging egg and emerging follicle.
So, Dr. McNabb, a question that I had a producer ask me once is, can you run the cows on this and start the same day as the heifers, or do you need to offset them on some of these protocols if you're running the cows and heifers on different protocols? Because like this one, I see the days are the same, but what happens if you're trying to run two at the same time?
Oh, so you'd have different windows for insemination. So you could still start them all at the same time, right? But then look at, your time frames are going to be, in this case, 10 hours different. So if you had the druthers, you could, AI one group in the morning, one group in the evening. But it actually brings up a good point. If you have a large group, you may want to break it down into smaller groups that you'll be able to breed on schedule. Because if you have 100 synced and you can only breed 10 an hour, then by the time you get to the last 20 to 30, they're going to be out of the ideal window for insemination. So you might, with planning, think about that. The use of MGA, so that melangestrol acetate, the oral progesterone form, we feed it in a crumble or a pellet. It's a different approach to using that. So this can be great for helping heifers transition through puberty and priming them for their first insemination. It can also be used to suppress feedlot heifer cycling. When we use it, it's interesting. It causes some bad effects in the cow, and it causes the first ovulation after we stop feeding it to be subfertile. So we don't tend to breed on that first heat. We will feed MGA for typically 14 days to give her a good progesterone priming. We'll stop feeding it, let her come into heat and ovulate, but we're not going to touch that ovulation. So that's why you start to see these 19-day windows between stopping the feeding and then doing some other kind of manipulation on a cycle to capture the subsequent fertile ovulation. You can heat detect in AI. You can have timed AI protocols. You can even add a whole co-sync with the cedar on the end of this if you wanted to. But the whole concept with using MGA is to wait one cycle before manipulating them. It's there to help jumpstart them cycling and give them that progesterone base. But you do not want to breed right here, right after you stop feeding that MGA. Cedars don't have the same effect. They are quite innocuous when it comes to the quality of ovulation, but MGA is not. Okay, and the last protocol I always want to show you again is with sexed semen. So like I mentioned, in both cows and heifers, we're going to have a slightly different timeline as compared to conventional semen, just because the semen doesn't last as long once it's in the female reproductive tract. So there are many recommendations and some studies to show that heifers and cows that are display heat before insemination have a higher conception rate with sex semen as compared to those that don't display heat. And on the surface, that might say, well, obviously that makes sense. But if you think about a lot of the timed AI protocols that we have, they weren't designed to really have heifers and cows showing heat. They were designed to time ovulation specifically. We just happen to see heat coming in the background. So it kind of turns that concept on its ear here. So the protocols I have as an example here are showing using a co-sync with the cedar, but then using estrus detection aids, that's what the EDA is, and any animal that you see having come into heat in that window, AIing at the predetermined time with sex semen, and using conventional semen for the remainder. Just again, showing the differences that we have between the two.
So before you skip really quick on that, there was a couple questions.
Oh.
Can you reuse cedars?
Yes, you can. So they are designed to have about a 14-day release of progesterone. So in general, when we place them, we like to dip them in. I like to dip them in like dilute Novosan, like Novosan water, just to keep them clean as they go in. When you pull them out, if you clean them and dry them and keep them in a cool place out of the light, you can reuse them. Just a word of caution. They can spread disease if they get dirty and you don't clean them properly. And I always worry about the amount of progesterone coming out on that 13th to 14th day, just because we're getting to the end. So if you're doing two protocols that you need 7 days of cedar, I might worry about that second protocol. I think if you're doing two 5-day protocols, it's probably going to be okay to do as long as you're clean about it.
And one more question about the cedars is, do you experience any infection problems with leaving a cedar in heifers for 14 days on the 7-7 protocol?
Not if they're placed in a clean manner. So we don't want to be pushing dirt or manure up in there. So we'll clean off the vulva. That's why I like to dip the cedar in the applicator in like a bucket that has some dilute Novosan and water, and then put some lube on and go up and in and place the cedar like that. And so I think if it's done in a clean manner, they're fairly non-reactive. We don't tend to see a lot of vaginal infection come from them.
So one other question, you talked about the effectiveness of sex semen in protocols, but is there a study that talks about combining straws from different bulls has a higher conception rate?
You know, there is some research showing that sperm likes to compete with other sperm. And I'll give you an example. In pigs, when we AI pigs, it's very common to combine multiple boars into one dose of semen because they see the prostaglandins that are present in semen help compete, if you will. We don't typically recommend that because it requires going in multiple times, and from a pedigree perspective, we like to know who was bred to who. So I guess I don't have a strong recommendation there, although other than to say there probably is some legitimate science behind it, but it's not a standard recommendation that we make.
We have another one that fits in here if you're okay for that.
Yeah.
So if I have late calving cows, I could short cycle them with injections and try to get them to calve earlier in the next year.
Yes, if they're cycling. Yeah. So again, if they're the cows that were the last to breed up and the last to calve, we're going to keep on your normal breeding season. That's giving them a very short window to have a calf, have the uterus return to its normal size, regain cyclicity, and be ready to synchronize. So you can, but you're giving them a very tight window to do.
And one more question, if an animal is synchronized, will that animal keep the cycle moving forward, or does it revert back to the natural cycle?
Oh, good question. As long as there are no other outside influences, she should stay on that new cycle that you've created for her. The things you see. So in estrus, cows have nice, thick, clear estral mucus coming from their vulva. This is what helps to lubricate the cervix for normal sperm in natural breeding, and it helps lubricate the cervix and the vagina when you're passing your AI gun through. So if you see that, it's a good sign it's time to breed. If you see reddish or blood-tinged mucus or reddish discharge, that's a very natural phenomenon. It's what we call metastral hemorrhage. So it's very natural, even though we don't always see it. It's not always observed, even though it's almost always happening. Basically, that just means it's too late to breed because that happens after ovulation. So if you see that when you're going to breed, don't waste the semen. Move on to the next. When it comes to preparation, I'm just going to go briefly through the technique. Again, we're going to find our semen appropriately and safely in the tank. We'll thaw it at about 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit for anywhere from 45 to 60 seconds in a warm water bath. Dry the straw off with a paper towel. Cut off the sealed end, and we like to use a little guillotine cutter just so we don't split and crease the end of the straw. We're going to load it into ideally a warm AI gun with the opened end facing out, and then we'll put a plastic sheath over that to hold the straw in. After that, we're going to keep the gun warm because, again, at this point, time and temperature are going to be your biggest enemies. So no cold shock, out of the wind, out of the cold, and really we should be AIing within 10 minutes of preparing the semen and loading the gun. Technique, one hand will be in the rectum of the cow or the heifer. We will find the reproductive tract, find her cervix, stretch that cervix forward, and then clean off the vulva and introduce the AI gun through her vulva up in her cervix. The idea here, they have a lot of pitfalls. So they have what's called the vaginal fornix, which is right here in their vagina. That's a nice little blind-ended pouch that is very easy to get your gun into. So by stretching the cervix forward, we're going to collapse that down and allow you to actually get into the opening of the cervix. And then we're going to gently manipulate the cervix around your AI gun until you pass all the way through. We're going to be depositing semen in the body of the uterus. So we're not going to go up into the two horns that exist. We're going to go just past the cervix and deposit our semen there so that there's no chance of causing any trauma as we pass up one horn or the other. We're not checking which ovary she's about to ovulate on, so we don't know. But by putting the semen into the body of the uterus, that semen will distribute itself up both horns and give both sites of fertilization a good chance. Overarching, record keeping. It is important to keep records, whether that is through a computerized software, an Excel spreadsheet, a piece of paper on a clipboard, notes in your phone. It is important, one, to keep track of what you're doing and to make a plan. If you're going to synchronize an AI, you should have a plan in place. So when do you want to have calves on the ground? Pick a date or a window of time, and you can backtrack from there to create your schedule. You're going to have your expected calving dates. You can back up to your expected preg check dates, your expected breeding dates, and then make a synchronization protocol that allows you to achieve that expected AI or breeding date. You can then plan your vaccination protocols around this again, so you're not vaccinating within 30 days of AI. You can plan for when you're going to have people to help you detect heat and or calf, and you can plan for when you're going to diagnose pregnancy. So you, by laying it out and keeping track of what you do and not just relying on your memory is very helpful. Keeping a record of the semen you're using. So what you ordered, okay, from the catalog or your semen rep is important. Verifying it on receipt. So when you receive that semen, when it's shipped to you or you go to pick it up from somebody else, make sure that the cane matches the paperwork that you have, and that you're not going to accidentally put a bunch of Charolais semen in your Angus heifers. After you thaw the straw, before you load the gun, again, double check that the straw is the appropriate sire that you want to use. We then will always keep that record. So whether we write down the registration number and the information on the straw, whether you tape that straw to a piece of paper and keep it, whether you take a picture of the straw with your phone and save that photo, there are a lot of easy ways to maintain that information. And if you're maintaining your own tank, make sure that you are always checking your liquid nitrogen levels. Most tanks should have easily maintained liquid nitrogen levels for 6 to 8 weeks. So we recommend every 4 weeks having them topped off and filled. And if you're going to be using cleanup bowls, so you're going to have your artificial insemination done, and then you're going to turn it in bowls to breed anyone who didn't conceive to the AI, which is very standard. We typically wait 14 days after the insemination to turn the bulls in. If they're cycling normally, they shouldn't be coming back into heat until 20 or 21 days after AI. So 14 days is still plenty of time. And it prevents a bull going right after the cow that just came out of the chute, that just got AI'd, and breeding her and mixing up his semen with the semen you just bought and went to all the time and effort of getting it into her. So typically waiting 14 days. Then at preg check and at calving, you have a natural break. And even without parentage identification, you can be reasonably confident as to who was bred to AI versus who was naturally bred. Pregnancy diagnosis, one, did she come back into heat or not? If she never came back into heat, either you missed it and you didn't see it, or she could be pregnant. We do recommend preg checking, whether it's with transrectal palpation, transrectal ultrasound, using blood work. So we have these substances called PAGs, pregnancy-associated glycoproteins, that are produced by the placenta of cows, and they get into the cow's bloodstream. So after 28 days post-breeding, if she's pregnant, we can detect these with a blood sample from the cow and say, yes, she's pregnant, or no, she's not. We can't tell stage or age or numbers of fetuses that might be present. We can give a yes or a no. And so we do recommend that. And if you're interested, if you have a small scale operation and you want to sex the fetus, the magic window for sexing the fetus with ultrasounds would be between days 58 to 70 of pregnancy in cattle. And again, this is very helpful, one, to check your success rate and to distinguish AI bred from bull bred pregnancies. There are a lot of good resources out there for you. The Beef Reproduction Task Force, the website's here, is an excellent resource. And I took some of the images tonight from their recommended protocols. They go through the research that's being done, and they make recommendations for synchronization protocols for cows and heifers based on the information available. They've been going for 20 or 22 years now, because in the early 2000s, there was a lot of confusion as to what to do and what not to do, especially in beef cattle, because a lot of these protocols were originally designed for dairy cattle that have been manipulated and tweaked a bit to be more applicable for beef cattle. So I would recommend going there. They have a lot of great resources and really handy handouts you can download and look at. They also have the calculator, which I have an example of here, where you can go in and put in different parameters, and it can help you with some of the economics of AI and how you might be able to, based on different assumptions you put in there, make some decisions versus AI or bull breeding for your herd. It's a really handy tool. And you can download it in an Excel format and then manipulate it like that. And a shameless plug, we, in conjunction with the Animal Science Department here, we teach an artificial insemination clinic every year on the UC Davis campus. We hold it the last week of March every year, and occasionally we do one in the fall as well. Registration is open right now, and it's a 3-day course where we go through a lot of the things we just talked about, but in more depth. The technique, semen selection, estrus cycles and manipulation, some handling and facilities things, And we have 3 days of hands-on. So we go through the technique with you, and you get into cows to practice AIing 3 days in a row. So we really try to give you the tools you need to be successful in artificial insemination. There are other programs out there as well. And so if you are looking to improve your skills or learn this for the first time, I would recommend signing up for a course that'll kind of give you a crash course in it. But when it comes down to it, the technique, just like many other things, it's a numbers game. So it just takes practice and doing it over and over again before you get better and better and faster at it.
So on that, Dr.
And with
McNabb,
that,
what is a good AI success rate or goal?
for beef cattle, I would say that initially targeting at least 50% would be a good goal. In healthy, well cycling herds, I try to push myself. I'd love to see 70% conception rates, but I'm happy with anything over 50%. Because if you think about all the manipulation we're doing here, we are really fighting nature in some ways. And again, given that we often see from a one-time bull breeding a natural conception rate of about 70%, I don't try to push myself beyond that. If you do this enough, you'll have times when you get 80-90%. You'll have times when you get 30%. But in healthy cycling beef cattle, I would target somewhere between 50 to 70%.
Perfect. We had a few other questions in the
Okay.
Q&A from earlier that said, the first one is, I just had a first calf heifer have a calf late, but the bull got in after bulls had been pulled. Is there a way to hurry her up to conceive so that she won't be out of cycle from the rest of the herd?
So, yes. So if she calved late, so again, we're going to be fighting that postpartum anestrus. So really, I wouldn't try to do anything before 45 to 50 days, to be honest. After that, yes, one way that we do it in heifers is to use a cedar. So by placing a cedar, we're giving her some progesterone priming. That primes the brain to be more responsive to estrogen. So if you wanted to try and jumpstart her, starting at 50 days, you could probably place a cedar for 12 to 14 days, pull the cedar, and she would likely start to cycle after that, as long as everything else is normal and functional.
Another question, are they starting to test the bulls for the BHF genetic defect? And are they going to add that to the MBV?
So there's a lot of development with different genetic defects and tests right now. So I think so, but it's improving every year. And we just got the one for brisket disease and high altitude then going into play. And so every breed association will also have different requirements. So continue to check in with them because they'll know right away when something's been validated that's going to be useful within that breed. So about every year we have new and updated tests coming out as genetic markers are identified.
Okay, another one is, why does the Angus Association allow the registration and sale of bulls that are potential carriers? What is your risk if you could potentially breed a potential carrier bull to his offspring?
So each breed association kind of takes a different approach to genetic disease. To their credit, the Angus Association has been more forward thinking and more really been the leader in a lot of genetic testing and exclusion based on results because they want to eliminate a lot of genetic disease. I'm not sure what disease specifically you're referring to because a lot of carrier states have been eliminated from the registry pool. But even if they're in there, the chances, right, when you have a carrier for a simple recessive mutation, then you need to be breeding to another carrier. And when a carrier breeds to another carrier, on average, you have about a 25% chance of that homozygous state coming up and that defect being expressed. So that would be the statistical risk if you have it there.
So another question is, for breeding a few cows with AI, could a simple program be give the cow an injection of luteolase, then watch her inbreed on the natural heat 1 to 5 days after that single shot, or do you have to wait 10 days and then give another shot?
Yes. So yeah, you can definitely use one shot, one dose of prostaglandin, watch her. If she hasn't come into heat in 5 days, it's actually that was one of the original prostaglandin protocols in the early 80s when synthetic prostaglandin was brand new and was extremely expensive. People were trying to conserve it as best they can. So you could do that, heat detect for 5 days and breed accordingly. If you have not seen anyone who's left, give them a dose of prostaglandin and do the same thing for another 5 days. That would be fine. The other way was just a blind way to approach it without doing all that heat detection in between.
Thank you to Dr. McNabb for sharing with us details and tips for cattle AI and beef herds. During the video, there were references to resources and other webinars. You can find those at ucanr.edu/sites/rangelands/cattle health. Thank you for watching this webinar recording that was brought to you by University of California Cooperative Extension and University of California Davis Veterinary Medicine, and was co-hosted by University of California Cooperative Extension advisors Tracy Schohr, Grace Woodmansee, Rebecca Ozeran, and specialist Dr. Gaby Maier.